Ms. Jacobs tells me that you found the Industrial Revolution sadly lacking in battles, wars, and general mayhem. This unit has a few bloody revolutions and some relatively minor wars, but for the next major outpouring of blood and gore, you're going to have to wait for Unit 9 in World War I. Still, you won't understand why Europe plunged into such a deadly and stupid conflict if you don't have some notion of the idea stew that was simmering throughout most of the 19th century. Merriam-Webster's dictionary defines an ism as a distinctive doctrine, cause, or theory, and no century gave birth to more isms than the 19th. Why? Well, remember how back in the beginning of the course we talked about the disasters of the 14th century, plague, the 100 Years' War, the church schism, the fall of Constantinople, and how they helped turn the world upside down and therefore make way for a newer and more modern world. The French Revolution and Napoleon and the Industrial Revolution together had a similar impact. You've already talked about this first ism, nationalism, and about the Congress of Vienna's less than successful efforts to keep it under control. Just a quick review. Why do I have a picture of Napoleon under the picture of a genie escaping a bottle? Well, Napoleon fired up French nationalism and rode it to great victories, but then he got caught by surprise when his invasion sparked a similar nationalism in the countries he conquered. And nationalism is really going to be the most dangerous of the forces that we're going to look at over the next century. The radical notions of liberty, fraternity, and equality, combined with the social consequences of the Industrial Revolution, produced a major new theory about how the world worked and ought to work. So stay tuned for your next lesson. Darwin's theory of evolution would challenge traditional religious views and transform biology. But we're actually going to look more closely at a much cruder and more racist ism, social Darwinism, or the notion that this concept of the survival of the fittest could be applied to nations and peoples. And finally, we will look at imperialism, or how Europe, for about a century, more or less took over the world. But I'm going to kick off our parade of isms with an artistic and literary movement, Romanticism. Sometimes I think you learn the most about what's really going on in people's minds and hearts by listening to their music, looking at their art, even more than by looking at charts and graphs. So, no more charts and graphs in this lecture. You've encountered this painting before. It's Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Now you know something about the Revolution of 1830, which was actually the revolution that inspired the painting. This is one of the most famous works of Romanticism. So what I want to explore today are the characteristics of Romanticism in art, music, and, at least on your quiz, literature. Then, as we get into the other isms of the 19th century, I want you to think about how Romanticism influenced them. On your quiz, you're going to see artistic and literary examples of Romanticism that I am not showing you, and you'll need to figure out which elements of Romanticism they show. So take notes, okay? To understand the artistic developments of the 19th century, and by artistic I'm talking about music and literature as well as the visual arts, you need to understand that they are all about rejecting the previous generation. So, in the closing days of the French Ancien Regime, that's when there was that parade of Louis, 13, 14, 15, 16. This was the kind of painting that sold to the only people who had money to buy paintings. Pictures of frivolous aristocrats committing adultery in beautiful gardens. The next generation, caught up in the Enlightenment and then the French Revolution, was disgusted by all those paintings of misbehaving aristocrats. They thought they were frivolous, if not dangerous. The Enlightenment thinkers believed in reason and in virtue, and especially what they saw as the virtue of Republican Rome. Remember David, the fellow who painted French revolutionaries and then Napoleon? This is one of his paintings from 1789. That's the year the French Revolution began. The painting depicts Brutus, a Roman leader, grieving for the loss of his dead sons, who are shown on the funeral bier on the left. But there's a twist to the story. Brutus himself had ordered the sons executed. Brutus's sons had attempted to overthrow the government of the Republic and restore a monarchy, so their father ordered their death to maintain the Republic. So why would this be a popular subject with French revolutionaries? Well, they were busy guillotining people for the good of revolution, right? Or they would be very soon. So let's get back to this later revolutionary painting. In what way are the themes of the two paintings the same, and in what ways are they different? Well, they're both about fighting tyranny and fighting for the revolution, right? But I think the revolutionary hero on the right, that's Brutus, is very static. He seems to be just sitting there thinking great thoughts. Our mythical legendary heroine, Marianne, and her sidekicks, by contrast, are bursting into action. The painting has much more color, much more movement, much more drama. I'm going to quickly show you a few more romantic paintings without comments. For now, I just want you to think about the characteristics of these paintings. Maybe talk about this in class. Okay, I'm going to come back to romantic paintings, but to tease out what Romanticism means, I'd like to turn first to music and that noted musical expert Bugs Bunny. Art historians describe paintings like David's as neoclassical. In music, we use the term for music of this period as classical, which is actually a technical term that doesn't just mean everything that doesn't have words, but music from a particular period, the period of the Enlightenment. What we're going to see and hear first is a bit of Bugs Bunny playing Mozart's Concerto No. 23 in A major. What I want you to think about is, how would you describe this music? Are there any ways that it reminds you of neoclassical paintings like David's? Well, Mozart's music is very reasoned, very orderly. It follows logical patterns, although they're developed with great beauty and imagination. So what you're going to hear and see now is a parody of the Ring Cycle, a series of operas composed by Richard Wagner, who was one of the most important composers of the Romantic era. He based these operas on German folk tales. One of the characteristics of Romanticism, one of the ways it ties into nationalism, is that Romantics were fascinated with national folk tales and folk music, with recapturing their past. So the tune for the first Kill the Wabbit sequence is Wagner's famous Ride of the Valkyries, which you've probably heard before, though you may not have known it by name. I'm not going to worry about the rest of the plot, but what I want you to think about is, first, how does Wagner's music differ from Mozart's? I also want you to think, second, about how the imagery in the cartoon, which is itself also a parody of Romanticism, resembles what you just saw in romantic paintings. And here comes another great example of romantic music from later in the 19th century. Not only is the music itself highly dramatic, it was actually composed to tell a particular story. So who knows the story of the Sorcerer's Apprentice? Well, the story comes from a poem by one of the greatest romantic authors, the German poet Goethe. An old sorcerer leaves his workshop after giving his apprentice some chores. The apprentice is tired of fetching water with a pail, so he casts a spell on the broom, so it's going to do the job. But the young apprentice, that's Mickey Mouse, of course, doesn't quite know how to cast the spell properly. The broom fights back. He attacks the broom. It splits into lots of brooms. Anyway, let's watch a couple of short clips from this wonderful Disney version. And by the way, The Sorcerer's Apprentice was a romantic poem, but it was based on old folk tales, another element of Romanticism. By the way, the sequence has some other romantic elements. Based on this and on the Bugs Bunny opera, think about what some of those elements might be. Well, the painting and the animated tale of The Sorcerer's Apprentice both capture some important elements of Romanticism and have things in common. There's a solitary hero who seems to be battling the forces of nature on his own. It's a very famous painting of a solitary hero. The French Revolution had been all about sacrificing the individual for the good of the greater community. One of the ways Romantics rebelled against their parents was reasserting the importance of the heroic individual, especially the individual who did not go along with the crowd, who did not follow the mob. Here's another element of Romanticism that we saw in the cartoons and in the painting. What do you think I'm getting at? Nature in Romantic art and music is not tame. Enlightenment thinkers wanted to dissect nature. They wanted to discover its laws and explain them with mathematics. Romantic artists wanted to feel the power of nature. They wanted to get blown around by the wind, and they kind of enjoyed being scared of nature. Romantic art, music, and literature is full of storms and natural disasters. What's Opera Doc makes this deliberate fun of this very well. The writers and artists of the Enlightenment celebrated reason. The Romantic generation kind of turned against reason. Reason, after all, had brought them the guillotine and Waterloo. They not only valued passion and emotion over reason, they were often fascinated by the weird, the macabre, even the insane. Here are the brooms coming to life in The Sorcerer's Apprentice, next to a painting by the Spanish painter Goya, whom you saw in the French Revolution unit. This is a painting of a so-called witches' Sabbath. Pretty weird, huh? The Romantics may have turned against reason, but they did not turn against revolution. They just focused more on its romantic elements: violence, passion, and a hero who leads the fight against oppression. You've seen liberty leading the people. Another revolution that captured the imagination of the Romantics was taking place in Greece, which was fighting to overthrow its Turkish rulers. It was ruled by the Ottoman Empire, as was most of southeastern Europe. The famous British Romantic poet Lord Byron actually died in Greece, where he was helping the revolutionaries. So this is a painting of a Greek freedom fighter, also by Delacroix, the same painter who painted the Liberty Leading the People, of course, also a very nationalist painting. Another Romantic hero was the individual who fought for social reform, often against great odds. So Wilberforce was seen by many as a Romantic hero. This is a famous English painting by a painter named Turner called The Slave Ship. It's based on a true story about six slaves who were thrown overboard so that the slave trader could collect insurance money. You collected insurance money on dead slaves, not on sick slaves. Beside the social message, what other Romantic element do you see? Well, nature is pretty violent here. Here's a close-up where you see fish munching on slave corpses. Again, this is not a sentimental view of nature. But there was a sentimental side to Romanticism. The writers and artists of the Enlightenment loved the classical era, which they saw as another age of reason. The Romantics turned back to the Middle Ages for inspiration, especially the lost world of knights, castles, and a church that dominated every aspect of life. This, they thought, was a world of passionate heroes and true love. The interest in the medieval showed up in architecture, where the Gothic architectural style of medieval cathedrals had a big revival. These are the British Houses of Parliament. They look like they were built in the Middle Ages, right? Actually, construction on them started in 1840. Another retreat from reason and another rebellion against their parents was a return to a more personal, mystical religion. The Enlightenment thinkers tended to see God as the great clockmaker, as the God who created a universe according to Newton's laws, but maybe wasn't someone you talked to very intimately. And of course, the leaders of the French Revolution rejected religion altogether. There was a religious revival in the 19th century. Now, the Romantics did not reject the scientific revolution, really, although they were a little more suspicious of it. But they focused more on religious mysteries and on personal emotion. You see a couple of paintings that kind of illustrate this. But it was during this period that the Methodists gained millions of followers in England. The Methodists emphasized personal piety and an emotional connection with God. It was really part of the Romantic era. Romantics also used paintings to celebrate their own national heritage and their struggle against oppression. You've seen both of these paintings before. The one on the right is Goya's famous painting of guerrilla fighters being executed by their French conquerors. Remember that Napoleon thought that the backward Spanish would welcome his enlightened rule, and he was wrong. Romantic artists were also fascinated with the strange and the foreign, much as they were obsessed with insanity and the occult. This is another painting by Delacroix, our liberty leading the people painter. It's set in Tangiers in what today is Morocco. Here's another Tangiers painting. Again, Delacroix. Enlightenment painters didn't like all those sexy aristocratic pictures. The Romantics, with their focus on emotion and passion, were quite willing to bring sex back into art, especially when they were portraying it in strange and exotic places. So, again, this harem was painted by our fellow Delacroix. Where would you guess this building is located? Well, it was obviously influenced by Indian architecture, especially the Taj Mahal, but actually it was built in the British seaside town of Brighton in the 1820s, another very romantic work. Sometimes the Romantics were sentimental about nature when they saw it being destroyed by industrialization. So one of the trends in Romantic art are a lot of sort of very sentimental countryside landscapes. This, by the way, was a form that Romanticism took in the United States. And you'll see the Hudson River School probably when you study American history next year. At any rate, this was still another way that the Romantics rebelled against their parents. So here's another painting by Turner, who painted the slave ship. But here's a close-up. What do you think? Does this artist really hate the locomotive? Or does he see the locomotive as a kind of romantic hero fighting nature? I think maybe a little of both, which, as we'll see in the next lesson, is a little how Marx and the socialists and communists viewed the Industrial Revolution and its social consequences. So, here's a painting from the later 19th century of a third-class railway carriage. In other words, the part of the train that the poor people traveled on. So, how do you think the next generation rebelled against Romanticism, against their parents? Well, they became realists. Oops, sorry, I didn't switch that quickly enough. So, stay tuned.